I'm Garth Braithwaite. I work at Adobe. I work on a couple open source projects. Before the one I was working on, I was full-time open source designer for a project called Brackets, which is a really cool project. Thanks, James. It's an open source HTML editor, so it's really cool. It has a ways to go still before it competes with a lot of editors, but it's built in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so its hackability is very high. And then I work on a project called Topcoat, and focus, come on, focus. Yeah, that's the best we're gonna do. But you can imagine how you spell Topcoat. Topcoat is an open source CSS library with components. So you just throw in some HTML, throw in the CSS that you need, and you've got the components the way you need them. And it's designed for mobile and desktop. That one was good, however, there you go. Whoa.
Oh, it's probably affecting the other group. Oh, yeah,
That's awesome. There's like, let's do the war. Let's fight. Yeah. But you guys have good imagination, so we're good. So anyway, I was originally a full-time designer on Brackets. I was the lead, the first one on that one. And then I'm now a full-time engineer on Topcoat. So it's an interesting switch for me. And I think it's actually worked out well for some of this stuff for this presentation. But if you have any questions, remember GarthDB, because you can't add me on Twitter right now. So the idea behind some of this stuff, you can see I've got a lot of stuff. I didn't think it was fair that I was allowed to have a computer and you weren't. So I did my presentation in such a way that I don't need my computer. I didn't expect applause, but I'll take it. And the idea for this presentation has come over about 1.5 years of discussions I've had. And it started with the simple question of how come software developers really have latched on to the open source movement, and how come designers have not? What is the difference there? And so there was a lot of arguments that I've had with people. It's somewhat of a polarizing topic, it turns out. And I've kind of distilled some of that into some of my own thoughts. So to start with, we're going to have a little story time, kind of discussing the history of open source software. So I don't have any music. I'd have to literally bring in a keyboard to do it without technology. So back in the early 80s, Richard Stallman was a faculty at MIT. And he was working on some other stuff, but they had a printer in the final countdown. That's just cheesy. It's very dramatic. Okay. Thank you. So they had a printer in their lab, and it had a problem with the printer. And so he had the know-how. He went online and found the source code for this printer. Now, this was in the day when printers are not a separate, they had operating systems, right? These are giant machines. So he went on and he fixed the problem himself. And that was cool. But then Xerox came in and said, hey, MIT, I've got a new printer for you. So they donated the printer to MIT. So how are you going to turn down a new printer? So they brought in this new printer. It was faster, still had the same problem of the previous one. But when he went to go find the source code, it wasn't available. He even went and talked to somebody who was at MIT who worked on the operating system the year before. They couldn't get it for him. So he was kind of ticked, right? Because not only did he have the know-how and the need to do it, he did not have access to the tools that he needed to fix it. And he's the sort of guy that they were in a very hacking environment, so they would share their solutions, and that's how they got around problems, bugs. They wouldn't wait for the software company to fix them. They would go in and fix them themselves and then share them around. So this kind of ticked him off. There was a couple other stories that he has, but that was the one that he uses as his turning point. But he started a project called GNU. And GNU stands for GNU is not Unix. Pretty much what he did, he broke off, he left MIT so that they couldn't own any of his code in any way, shape, or form. And he decided to make free software. And he said, to start, we might as well go with an operating system, right? It's just a small project. So he started by building his own operating system, which is GNU. And this was in 1983. So we're actually coming up, it was in September, so we're hitting the 30th anniversary of GNU. So it's kind of a big deal for the open source software community. Along with GNU, he started the Free Software Foundation a couple years later. And both of these have kind of the premise that software should be free. And he says free as in freedom, not free as in beer, is the way to describe it. He actually says if you can find a way to make money off of it, that's cool. But don't restrict it with a license. Make it free and open to everybody. So the four things that he says it should be free to do. Users should be free to use the software, to study it, which I think is a very interesting point, to modify it and to redistribute. I can't think of anyone who's like, yeah, I want to get into Word and see how they wrote that. But there is that aspect of it. And I think we definitely have that with web tech. That's why there was a lot of problems with some of Flash stuff, is because people would do amazing things, and then they'd compile it and put it up as a Swift that nobody could run, or no one could get the source code from. You have people like decompiling. That was messed up, right? But yeah, so leaving things open so that everyone can play around with it. So a couple years later, it's actually 1991, Linus Torvalds he released a kernel that he was working on called Linux. And if you don't know what a kernel is, you should go look it up on Wikipedia. It's interesting to understand what it means, but it's not a big deal. So the kernel that was in GNU, so remember they were working on it from 1983. This is 1991. They had a kernel in it, but it wasn't very good. They weren't happy with it. So they scrapped the kernel that was in GNU. And in 1992, when it was released under the GPL, when Linux was released under the GNU public license, they adopted Linux in as their kernel. So what we call Linux now is an operating system. The name Linux actually only pertains to a very small portion of Linux. The rest of it's actually GNU. And he had this big push. Richard Stallman wanted it. Everyone, we need to start calling it Linux GNU. But no. So yeah, you can correct people and be that guy. If anyone's like, I use Linux, I'm like, no, you don't. It's only a small part. So yeah, Linux, it's a penguin. It is interesting to note, I couldn't get their penguin to fit in my circle, so I had to load it up, yeah. It's like if they ate a beach ball. No, so he did release it originally in 1991. He released it with the source, but it didn't have the license, and so they couldn't use it right away. Even though the source was out there, they couldn't just take it. So it wasn't until he re-released it that it made it available for the public in a free way. And Linus has this quote attributed to him. He says, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And this talks mostly to software development, and it gets into a couple other things here, but it's really pertaining to the fact that in problems, when we're dealing with complex problems, the more eyes you get on it, the more potential for simple solutions that you have. Eric Raymond, actually took that quote and a couple others, and he wrote an article or an essay called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And in this, he discusses software development. He compares GNU's software development originally. He actually relates it to corporate software development, and he compares that with Linux and how it was developed. And the cathedral model relates to the way that when you build a cathedral, you know what you're going to be doing from start to finish, more or less. And so you do it, you build it, and then you release it when it's finished. While the bazaar meaning a marketplace, is something that's kind of organic. It's kind of always living and breathing, and it's always changing. And he found that with the software development, especially with bugs, when you're looking for bugs and when you are fixing bugs, the bazaar model was much more effective to finding creative solutions to things. As opposed to, I've got the plan, let's just do it this way. It seems chaotic, but it brought him better results, or he found better results. So he wrote this article, right, he originally was a presentation, then he released it as a book. And Eric, I'm going to miss my thing, we're 12? There you go, Frank Hecker at Netscape took that essay, and he combined it with a couple other things and released an internal memo at Netscape. And it was one of the motivating factors that turned Netscape into Mozilla, or Netscape started Mozilla, which is a pretty well-known open source foundation. So interesting stuff. And then Eric Raymond went on to co-found the open source initiative, which, I'm really mad about this. The open source logo, not open, okay? It's like, it's really not cool. They're like, must use the trademark, cannot, and they have all these restrictions. And I'm like, hey guys, it's not cool. Yeah, interesting side note. Okay, fast forward again. to 2005, Linus Torvalds, the guy who created the Linux kernel, he created another project called Git. And Git is a source control software, and it's a distributed version control. 2008, a small startup founded GitHub, which takes Git, the functionality of Git, and it adds some stuff on top of it and makes it very web-friendly. It has a nice web interface. I have a couple of my favorite features for GitHub. How many in here are using GitHub on a daily basis or regular basis? Okay. Anybody, I don't want to call you out. Anybody not? Sweet. Okay. So I've got Legos. Some of my favorite stuff. The way that we're using it on Bitbucket. I just heard that. Sorry. Yeah. Bitbucket's good. Yeah. So on Topcoat, the way that we're using it is we have repos with all of our components, a repository of our source code. And so people can go in there, and oftentimes they'll come in and they'll file an issue, and they'll say, hey, this doesn't work right, or hey, this color's weird. And we'll debate things with them. Okay? Open source does not mean open community to the point where it's designed by community. We have a design theme, and if they're recommending things that don't fit in with what we're doing, we kind of let them know and we correct it. We still have control. So anyway, when the community says, hey, you need to fix this thing, or I don't like the way this thing works, we'll debate it back and forth. And sometimes they'll say, I'm just going to go off and fix it myself. So they'll go ahead and fork it. And this is something specific to GitHub, but it actually duplicates a repo. Let's say Mark built this frog, and I want to change it. So I'll go ahead and fork it. It'll duplicate his repo into my account. And they're separate. So I can go ahead and say, it's weird that you have a blue frog. I'm going to go ahead and add some green to it. And when I get it to the point where I like it, I can submit a pull request. And what that does is it tells Mark that he can come get my code for free and apply it to his. And he has the decision at that point. It's his repo. He owns it. So he can go ahead and apply that change to his, or he can reject it. And from there, they're still separate. So if Mark wants to go and turn the frog into a unicorn or a butterfly or whatever he wants to do with it, that's cool. And if I don't want to collaborate with him on that part, then we stay separate. So there's a lot of options available to people. Now, all of this stuff was done in the open source community before, but GitHub really socialized it, and they made it available to the masses, which is where I think we're getting to the point where I think designers might feel more comfortable being involved in some of the stuff. The fact that you guys, most part, raise your hands. There's cool stuff in GitHub. If you want to talk about that more, we could do a whole session on GitHub for designers. So why does this matter? And why is it working is, I think, a very interesting question. Open source software does very well. And it's unclear to some people why. So MIT, a few years ago, they did a study. And they asked this question: why does it work? Why do people contribute to it? Why do they go out of their way to give free time, their very precious discretionary time, to a project to give away software to other people and the source, with no hope of ever making money off of it in the future? And they sent the survey around. Before doing the survey, and they even say this at the beginning of their session, or the beginning of the paper, they said that the academic thinking at the time assumed that people were doing it for external motivational reasons, that they were doing it for improved job placement or for career advancement within their own workspace. And that was just the common assumption within academic thinking at the time. But after the survey, they came to find out, this is a kind of a chunk of a quote, but it says, we find that enjoyment-based intrinsic motivation, namely how creative a person feels when working on the project, is the strongest and most pervasive driver. We also find that user need, intellectual stimulation derived from writing code, and improving programming skills are top motivators for project participation. So even though people thought it was for external reasons, they did it because they felt good, right? It was for very, very personal reasons that people work on open source projects. Daniel Pink, this was mentioned in the keynote yesterday. Daniel Pink wrote a book about this called Drive, and he actually talks about motivation in general, but he specifically gets into open source software. And he gave a TED talk on this, was really interesting. There's actually an RS Animate YouTube video that you should go check out if you haven't. But he boiled it down to 3 things that people do it for. They do it on an individual level for the challenge, the option of mastery, and for the chance to make a contribution to something meaningful. On top of that, he also talks about the importance of autonomy, which open source software really gives you. When you're working on an open source project, you have a lot of autonomy to be able to do what you think is right. So that's talking on an individual level, but what does open source software provide in a group setting, or what does it do for the community as a whole? There's a couple things that it provides in this interesting quote here. Did anyone fly in on Virgin America? I don't think they fly to Charlotte, do they? Okay. Has anyone flown on Virgin America in the past? Okay. Virgin America is awesome. If you haven't flown, they have a screen in the back of every headset. They actually have a Linux distribution running on that, and they actually have Doom in the system. So you can pull out the little remote that it has, and it's got a full QWERTY keyboard and an up, down, left, right, and you can play Doom on the plane. It's terrible. The user experience is really bad. But it's because they have this love of open source software. And the CIO said at OSCON a few years ago, he says, software built on pride and love of subject is superior to software built for profit. Which, think about all the money that we're pouring into software built for profit. And open source software, he feels, is, what's the word? He says superior. All right, so another idea that comes out of open source software is this increased collaboration. Because you have a connection with more people and you have more opportunity to interact with them solving a problem, there's actually an increased probability of these happy coincidences of combinations of ideas. There's a really good book written by Steve Johnson. He wrote a book called Where Do Good Ideas Come From? And there's a little video on that as well on YouTube, and a little RS Animate video that's worth checking out. And he says this is the conclusion of his talk. He says the real lesson on where good ideas come from, that chance favors the connected mind. The more people we have looking at the bugs, the more shallow they are, right? So the same idea applies here. The more people we have connected, the more opportunities we have for combining ideas. He actually says that most of our brilliant innovations come from the collision of ideas, and sometimes those ideas exist in other people's heads. So the more we can get those collisions happening, the more innovations we might be able to pop out. Okay, that's great. How does that relate to design? Or how can we reap those benefits? I guess, what are those benefits that we could reap in the design industry? I think fundamentally, designers and developers are not very different. I think that's why Blend Conf works out very, very well, is because at our base, we are the same. We are problem solvers. We spend our time looking for the best solutions for things, but we have different tool sets to accomplish that task. But you'll find designers and developers working towards the same goal for the most part. They just differ on the way it should be done, if there's any conflict at all. There doesn't have to be. So if we could apply some of these principles of open source to design, I think we would find that we could together improve the overall skill level of design as an industry. If we were more open about what we were doing and how we were doing it, we would be able to help new designers get up to speed faster. So many times as a new designer, I was like, how did that get done? Sometimes there's no way. You have to wait till Abu Zidu, I can't even pronounce his name, right? He was really good in the early days. He would find something cool that someone had done, and he would do a total knockoff of it, like not even like kind of different. He would get as close as possible, and then he'd write a tutorial on it. Those were awesome for being able to figure out how some of those things were done. And then also, I think not only helping new people, actually making sure that as an industry, designers, we can adapt to changes in our workflows and in our requirements. I'm sure all of you know somebody who's made the switch from print to web design, some way, shape, or form. It is the most painful experience for most of them. If you've done it yourself, I did it at one point, but yeah, it can be extremely painful. We're now making the switch from desktop to responsive. again, this is something that has growing pains associated with it. And the more open we can be about our processes, the quicker, hopefully, the easier it'll be for people to make those changes, and they won't have to make the same mistakes that we make. All right. Also, if we're able to be more open about our process and our workflow, then we'll hopefully have more collisions of ideas, and that we'll have these innovations pop out. And as a whole, we'll just be better, right? We'll come up with better solutions to problems. So yeah, open source makes everything better. And hopefully, you'll find satisfaction in your work. That's a probably. There's no guarantee on that. Probably. Tim gave a really good talk yesterday on the importance of side projects. I find that my side projects have been best when I'm at a terrible job. When I was in a really bad place, my side projects were amazing because they were the only hope I had to not kill myself, right? And the same can apply to open source software. It doesn't have to only work in terrible job circumstances, but it does help. If you're in a bad job, find a good side project that you can work on. So, those being the benefits, what does it look like? If designers were able to participate in the open source arena, what would that look like today? I wrote a list of things that I try and do myself and things that I would recommend. So number one, share your process. I think this is the simplest thing that everyone could do. Be more open about what you're doing if you're able to. If it's a project, right, and you're working in a corporate environment and they're like, don't tell anyone, right? Don't get in trouble over this. But if you can, share what you're going through. I have a couple of points on this, including your failed attempts. I think that one's super important. As designers, we're not very open to tell people when we fail terribly. Not right away. Maybe it still hurts a little bit. But we should be open about that because everyone does. You sometimes look at somebody and you're like, they've never made anything bad in their whole life. That's because they don't post anything that didn't work out. Also, we should mention who inspired us when we're doing this work. Everyone knows the quote, right? Good designers borrow, great designers steal, right? We all steal, but we don't tell anybody. This is the dirty little secret. We're like, I totally stole, don't tell anyone. But we should be open about it, especially if the person we stole from is in the community. Now, you got to be careful. You got to be different enough, right, that you're not pissing anyone off. But try to be open about where you're getting your inspiration from. A good place to start as well is start working on Dribbble. Dribbble was originally designed, if you go through Dan Cederholm's thinking on it, he said that it was because he wanted to see what his friends were working on. But what it's become, more than a work in progress type of thing, is here's my final polished project that looks amazing. And again, you run into that problem where if you go and look on Dribbble for too long, you realize that you'll never be good because everything on there is amazing. But I think we should post what we're doing as we're working on it. Post some screenshots, maybe on Dribbble, maybe on Twitter, maybe on a blog, whatever's easiest for you. Find some venue to yell it out to the internet. No one may care. That's very possible. But that's not the point. You're not doing it for followers. You're not doing it for fame or fortune. You're doing it to better the community. And along with that, another thing that's not happening very often on Dribbble that should is the rebound. I think the rebound is a brilliant idea. It gives you the option to be able to take someone else's design, and it's inviting you to build off of that design, to change it somehow, which totally messes with the whole idea of this is mine, no one should play with it. So I love that, and I don't think we do it enough as an industry. Share your source files. This goes along with how did you do that. If you don't have enough time to write a tutorial on how you did something, because that takes time, at least share your source files. If you have a PSD that you're able to, if you have the rights to be able to share it, or an AI file, go ahead and put that out there so new and upcoming people can see what you're going through. They may not look through it. And don't be afraid that everyone will realize I don't name my layers. That's okay. I think we'll find that most people don't. Dribbble also has this feature. If you have a pro account, you can upload a source file or a file associated with it. Go ahead and just tack that on there. It doesn't take too much more work. Number 3, and I love that I've heard this in a lot of places. In fact, I'm stealing a quote from Yesenia's talk yesterday. She quoted Kevin Sharon. Where did I put it? Said, don't be the designer that codes, be the designer with a bigger toolbox. By coding your designs or using code as a design tool, you open yourself to actually use tools like GitHub and all of those awesome functionality that comes with it. You can put your design, this is what we did on brackets. I would do an Illustrator file to the most minimal that I could, right, just to get the initial ideas flowing, and then I'd jump to the browser, and I would create a CSS, HTML, and JavaScript prototype. This is awesome for doing interaction prototyping. And you also have that solution where you don't have to worry about Photoshop lying to your client type of thing, right? And then I would upload those, or I would push those changes to a GitHub Pages branch, which means it actually hosts those files like a web page. So my manager doesn't have to figure out how to use an index file that I emailed to her. That's the worst, right? If you're doing that, there's something wrong. So she was able to go in and check out what we were doing and play around with the interaction. The developers never had to ask me for the size of things. They could use the inspection tools that they loved already. So overall, it was just a better workflow. And because they're up on GitHub, if someone actually wanted to contribute back or say, you know what, you didn't do that the best way, here's a pull request for something you could do differently, they can. They haven't, but they can. And I'm not sad that they haven't. That's not where the success is being pulled from, but it was a really good workflow for me. So not to harp on the same point that other people have made, but it is important. And number 4, collaborate. This is something also that I think we could learn from the open source software community. They have hackathons. They have different things where like, hey, let's get together and let's code something together. I think software developers as a whole are more likely to do that. I don't see many designers being like, hey, this weekend we should work on a poster. That would be fun. I don't see that. Designers, if you're like me, you have a folder of projects that someday you will get to, that I will never get to. Find someone that you like, that you respect and that you trust and that is different from you some way, and try and find a way to work with them. Let them push you a little bit beyond what you're doing, and spend a weekend doing something fun. Carve out some time. And get some of those projects off that top shelf. They're just gathering dust up there. Number 5, donate. If you're working with a client and you make 3 different logos and they pick one of them, ask if you can donate the other 2 you could do it under the Creative Commons 0 license is what it's called, but it's pretty much releasing it to the public domain. Post it on your blog or post it on Dribbble and make a reference to the Creative Commons license. If you go to creativecommons.org/public domain, they have 2 different licenses in there that describe what they are, and you can play around with them. But this saves you from any legal repercussions from it once you get permission for doing that. But yeah, I mean, you're not doing anything with those. They can be at least portfolio pieces, and they could be inspiration to other people. And then number 6, contribute. Go find an open source project that already exists. This is not hard. Go onto GitHub and find anything that you care about that you've used. You'll find that there's probably a ton on there of little tools that you've played with. And then you'll notice that they probably are using just the default README page, and you can save them from their terrible user experience, right? Nothing wrong with the default GitHub, but it doesn't differentiate them in any way, shape, or form. So I did this with a small project called Hipster. It's HTTPSTER. I realize I should have made a slide for that. But it's a really small server. It's a really fun little project. It doesn't do much, but I find I use it every single day that I'm working. So I made them a brand, and then I made a website, and I made it, I forked their repo, I made it in a GitHub Pages branch, and then I submitted a pull request to them. They pulled it in, didn't have to do any of the code themselves, they just hit accept, and now they have a page up on their GitHub account. So you can do stuff like that. There are a ton of them out there. I have on my list of things to do, and I'd be happy to collaborate with anybody, Jade and Stylus. Love their products, hate their websites. So things that they could use some help. And I actually do have a brand in the works for that one, and I've talked with TJ Holloway-Chuck, and yeah, so there's something in the works, but I still have work to do. And here's a shameless plug. If you want to contribute some design resources, you could contribute to Top Coat or Brackets. I made a terrible, horrible mistake on Brackets. When I was the lead designer, there was a time where I was redoing all of the websites. And while I was doing that, someone made a pull request of an updated website, right? They were starting to think about some of the things that we were already thinking about, and they made the contribution and made the pull request. I denied it, saying that we had something in the works and it would be coming out soon. It still isn't finished. I have moved on from that project. There's a new designer as the head on that project, and it's not a priority for him either. So now it's not being done, and I squashed that poor person's motivation for wanting to contribute to that project. So that's my confession there. But yeah, there are some fun stuff that needs to be done. Because Topcoat is a CSS library, it's really easy to hack away on some of the stuff, and because it's a very visual framework, it actually is designed to be themed. So we could use some themes if people wanted to play around with that, which would be fun. So those are my 6 recommendations with a shameless plug at the end. But I think we still have some blockers. There are still some obstacles that we have to overcome as an industry. And a lot of these have to do with the way that we think about things. And these have come out of the discussions and the fights that I've had over the year and a half. So if I offend you, then I probably did something right. But if I did, I apologize. That's not my intention. I'm more just trying to kind of push the conversation a little bit further. So these are some of the comments that I got. And I've distilled them down to maybe some bad words. So pride, I think that oftentimes we hesitate to contribute to an open source community type of thing because we're worried we won't get credit, which is entirely untrue. If you go look on GitHub and the way that it's built around credit. There's no way of not being accredited for what you did. You make a pull request, it says it's accepted, and it's like, hey, look what he did. He's now a contributor on this project. Also, I think we have this pride of, I don't want people to see how the sausage is made. It's not a pretty process, and I don't want to be judged for that. And we should overcome that fear. Everyone's doing something that looks ugly in the middle of it, right? Just let it finish, and they can be like, okay, all that was worth it. Unreasonable greed, this is the one that it comes down to, I don't want to give this away because someday it will make me money. Probably not, right? The number of domain names that you're sitting on, or that I'm sitting on, they're not going to make me money, right? So think about donating. I'm not saying give it all away and never do it. You can still do projects on the side that make you money. But if there's ones that won't make you money that you just care about, think about giving those up or giving them life, I guess, more than giving them up. Lack of desire, I think that designers are overworked as a whole. I think that we get crap as being a design industry. You look at an agency, you'll have a ton of developers, and you'll have, well, the agency I worked at, there was a very small number of designers, and they worked on everything, to the point that when they were done at the end of the day, they were done, right? They did not want to touch anything ever again. There was not side projects coming out. So there is this problem that we have, that being overworked. So find a place, quit your job. That's what I'm saying. Just quit your job. No big deal. Now, if you're working in a place where you feel overworked, try and communicate that. I don't think that most project or product managers really understand what that feels like on a level of being a designer. So try and communicate that a little bit. Try not to be, I can do that guy. That happens a lot because we're problem solvers, so whenever we find problems, we're like, yeah, I can solve them. Just bring them all on, and then we're like, I can't do anything. Yeah, so try and overcome that one. That's a hard one. Fear of committee, not commitment. I've talked with people, and they're worried that when I say open source design, they're like, I do not want everyone's input on the way I design. We get scared that the design by committee will happen to anything that we care about. There is an aspect of that, but you guys are adults, and you know how to take criticism, and you know how to say, yes, that's a good idea. No, we're not doing that, but I appreciate you talking about it. Let's discuss it a little bit further. Maybe we'll find a solution that works. So it's different. It's not corporate, because if you're starting an open source project, even if it's a small little thing, you are the owner of that project. Nobody can force anything upon you. So it's different. Tooling, I think we lack some of the tooling that the software development has, mostly because they build it. If they don't have it, they have the tools and the resources and the understanding to just be like, I whipped this tool out this weekend, fixes all my problems. As designers, we may not have the know-how for that. So I think that is a big stumbling block, and the only way I know of overcoming that is roping some developers into building it for us if we don't know how to do it ourselves. And then file format. If you're working with PSD and you're working with Illustrator or Sketch, these are binary files, and they're not something that you can really leverage Git for. You can make changes and you commit them and you can push them, but you won't be able to see good comparisons, and you won't be able to see how they're changing over time. So I recommend looking into SVG. It's an amazing file format with not many amazing tools to build it. Illustrator has some good support, not perfect support. I find I'm hand coding SVGs once in a while, and that is not a good thing. But look into it, because when you do it, it is an XML-based file format. So when you push, all the brackets assets were in SVG, and if someone made a change, I could go and see what line they made a change on, and I could see the difference between the two. It was really cool, being able to see the progress of just image assets. And then also, again, look at HTML and CSS and JavaScript, maybe more HTML and CSS, as design tools. They should be a file format that we're comfortable working in. And then all good open source movements have a manifesto. GNU has a really good manifesto. Mozilla has an amazing manifesto as well, if you go through and read them. GNU's manifesto has underneath it, Richard Stallman has the manifesto, the original one that came out around 1981 or 83, and then he has rebuttals to common arguments against open source software, not frequently asked questions. I love that. It's like, here's why everybody's wrong when they assume it's not good. So I wrote a humble manifesto. This is different than open source software ones, though, because I guess I'm a little bit more timid about it. They definitely draw a line in the sand and say everything should be open on some of these. So mine's a little bit more humble, but in good form, I put it on a napkin that no one will be able to read in this room. Here, let me see. Can I zoom in? Enhance. There we go. So this is my own personal creed now that I've distilled some of my thoughts into. And it should be, like all open things, an open document. So it's open to changes. I can't accept pull requests to the napkin, but I have put some of it online. So it says, I will find opportunities to design in the open. I will share good and bad experiences. I will find time for meaningful projects, which sounds like it'll be, it's a lot of hard work to make times for meaningful projects. I will openly participate in discussions. So even if you're not willing to contribute or can't find time to contribute, find opportunities to talk about things. Dribbble is it's one of those communities that I think has a lot of potential, but we're not using it right. So many times people will post things, and if it's not good, you don't get discussions about, oh, hey, have you thought about X, Y, or Z? It is like, looks nice, right? You get those comments, if you get any comments at all on anything you post. So participate a little bit more in some of these discussions. Work with others by choice. We oftentimes as designers work with others because that's what we do at work, and then we go home and say, please don't talk to me. So we should, I look for opportunities to work by choice. And then improve my toolbox, and falling into that is the learn to code idea. And if you go look at opensourcedesign.is, I have posted that on there, just a straight picture of it like 20 minutes ago, right? It's on there. It is a GitHub repo. It's github.com/opensourcedesignis. And I want to turn that into a place where we kind of talk about what it could be, because I don't think it's a thing yet, necessarily, or it shouldn't be one thing anyway, but it's a place where we could define what it really means. So if you want to help out on that, love some contributions. Otherwise, it'll be a little bit slow, but it's getting done. So I guess the conclusion is not just that designers can open source, but that the benefits are so good to our community that we should be open sourcing. And this isn't a criticism that we're not doing it. A lot of those things that I mentioned, people are doing it. I don't think as an industry we are doing it as well as we could be. And we're not calling it open source, which is cool. It doesn't need to be called open source. Richard Stallman actually hates the term. He much prefers free software. And so when they started talking about open source, he's like, that's not the same thing. So anyway, there can be disputes as to what we call it, but being more open in our community has great benefits. And because I can't help myself, I made a logo and I made stickers. So I have some of these if you have any, but if you want one. But I appreciate everyone coming. Thank you so much.